The stars had always called to humanity, and in the year 2247 they finally answered back. Captain Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge of the Aurora, watching the viewport as his ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel for the first time in human history. The crew had spent 6 months traveling beyond the solar system, farther than any human had ever gone. Daniel felt his heart racing as the sensors began picking up something impossible. There was a ship out there, and it was not human. Lieutenant Emma Bradford sat at the pilot station, her hands trembling slightly as she brought the Aurora to a full stop. Chief Engineer Jacob Miller ran diagnostics from his console, making sure every system was ready for whatever came next. Diplomatic Officer Claire Watson stood beside Daniel, her tablet ready to record everything. They had prepared for this moment for years, trained for every scenario, but now that it was actually happening, the reality felt overwhelming. The alien ship appeared on their screens. It was massive, easily 10 times the size of the Aurora, with a hull that seemed to shimmer with colors that human eyes struggled to process. Daniel opened a communication channel, broadcasting on every frequency they had. His voice was steady despite the fear in his chest. He spoke the greeting that Earth's government had prepared, offering friendship and peace to whoever might be listening. The response came in perfect English. A voice filled the bridge, deep and resonant, speaking with an accent that sounded almost musical. The voice introduced itself as Ambassador Velthara of the Zenthari people, representatives of something called the Galactic Council. Daniel and his crew exchanged shocked glances. Not only were they not alone in the universe, but there was an entire galactic civilization out there, and it had been waiting for humanity to arrive. Velthara's ship approached the Aurora slowly, and Daniel gave permission for the ambassador to come aboard. The airlock cycled open, and the crew got their first look at an alien being. Velthara stood nearly 8 feet tall, with a body that resembled an insect but moved with fluid grace. The ambassador's skin was a deep purple, and multiple eyes dotted its elongated head. Despite the alien appearance, Velthara's manner was warm and welcoming. The ambassador explained that thousands of intelligent species existed across the galaxy, all united under the Galactic Council's peaceful governance. For millennia, these species had lived in harmony, sharing knowledge and resources, protecting each other from the dangers of the cosmos. The Council had been watching humanity for decades, waiting for them to develop faster than light travel. Now that humans had achieved this milestone, they were ready to be welcomed into the galactic community. Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. All of humanity's dreams were coming true in a single conversation. Earth would no longer be alone, struggling in the darkness. They would have friends, teachers, allies among the stars. Velthara invited Daniel and his crew to visit Nexus Prime, the capital world of the Galactic Council, where humanity could formally petition for membership. Back on Earth, the news spread like wildfire. Commander Susan Morris was chosen to lead the diplomatic mission to Nexus Prime. She was a veteran negotiator who had brokered peace treaties between Earth's nations during the Unification Wars. With her went Colonel Richard Grant, a military advisor with a distinguished career, and Dr. Helen Foster, one of Earth's leading scientists. They boarded a Zenthari transport ship, which would carry them to the heart of galactic civilization. The journey took 3 weeks, and during that time, Susan and her team learned everything they could about the Council. The Zenthari provided them with databases full of information, histories of hundreds of species, details about galactic law and customs. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect perhaps, but Susan pushed those doubts aside. Humanity had sought peace for so long, and here it was being offered freely. Nexus Prime was beyond anything Susan had imagined. The planet was a monument to cooperation, with cities that blended architecture from countless worlds. Beings of every imaginable shape and size walked the streets together. Flying creatures soared through the air while aquatic species navigated through water-filled tubes that ran throughout the city. The council chamber stood at the center of the capital, a massive structure that reached toward the sky. Susan and her team were escorted into the grand hall where the council met. Hundreds of representatives from different species filled the chamber, each one unique and fascinating. At the center sat Supreme Chancellor Ixthen, a being made entirely of living crystal that reflected light in dazzling patterns. The Chancellor's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, welcoming humanity to this historic moment. The Chancellor spoke of the Council's mission to bring peace and prosperity to all intelligent life. War, poverty, and suffering had been nearly eliminated under Council guidance. Species that joined were given access to advanced technology, protected trade routes, and the collective knowledge of thousands of civilizations. In exchange, members agreed to follow Council law, which existed to maintain harmony and prevent conflict. Susan listened carefully as the terms of membership were explained. There were restrictions, of course. Military development was limited to ensure no species could threaten others. Territorial expansion was regulated to prevent conflicts over resources. Weapons research was forbidden beyond basic defensive needs. These seemed like reasonable requirements for a peaceful society, and Susan saw no reason to object. Back on Earth, not everyone shared Susan's optimism. General Marcus Webb sat in a meeting with President Elizabeth Morgan, arguing passionately against signing the treaty. He believed the restrictions were too severe, that humanity was giving up its right to defend itself and determine its own future. The general had fought in wars, had seen what happened when nations trusted too much and prepared too little. He feared the Council's offer was a trap, a way to make humanity weak and dependent. President Morgan listened to the general's concerns but ultimately disagreed. She had spent her entire political career working toward global peace, and now that dream was expanding to the stars. The Council was offering everything humanity had ever wanted: trade, technology, protection, and friendship with thousands of other civilizations. The price seemed small compared to the benefits. She believed that humanity's future lay in cooperation, not isolation. The treaty was signed in a ceremony broadcast across both Earth and Nexus Prime. Susan Morris placed her signature on the document, officially making humanity a probationary member of the Galactic Council. Celebrations erupted on Earth as people realized they were no longer alone. The age of human isolation was over. The age of galactic citizenship had begun. In the months that followed, Xanthari advisors arrived on Earth to help humanity integrate into galactic society. New trade routes opened, bringing alien goods and technology to human worlds. Human colonies began expanding into the zones designated by the Council. Everything seemed wonderful, and humanity embraced its new role eagerly. But hidden in the treaty's dense legal language were clauses that few had read carefully. The Council controlled which systems humans could colonize and which were forbidden. Human military ships could be no larger than frigates, barely enough to patrol trade routes. Any research into advanced weapons required Council approval, which was rarely granted. Humanity had gained the galaxy, but surrendered something precious in return. They had given up their sovereignty, their independence, their right to determine their own destiny. They had become subjects of an empire that ruled through smiles and kind words rather than force. And by the time they realized what had happened, it would be far too late to change course without war. 5 years had passed since humanity joined the Galactic Council, and the golden promises had turned to dust. Lieutenant Commander Kyle Rogers stood on the bridge of his merchant vessel, the Horizon Runner, staring at the planet below with growing anger. New Terra had been one of humanity's proudest colonies, a world of green fields and blue oceans where 10,000 settlers had built new lives. Now those fields were torn apart by massive mining equipment, and the oceans were choked with industrial waste. Navigator Beth Anderson brought up the colony's communications on the main screen. Settlement Director Amy Richardson appeared, her face gaunt and exhausted. She explained that Xanthari corporations had arrived 3 years ago, with Council permits to extract rare minerals from New Terra. The permits were legal under the treaty humanity had signed, classifying the planet as a shared development zone. The colonists had protested, but Council law was clear. The Xanthari had every right to strip mine the world, and the humans living there had no power to stop them. Kyle watched as Amy showed him the refugee camps where her people now lived. The Xanthari had taken the best land for their operations, forcing the colonists into cramped settlements with minimal resources. Food was scarce because the farms had been destroyed. Medical supplies were limited because the Council controlled all trade routes and deemed New Terra a low priority. Children were sick, adults were hungry, and nobody seemed to care. This was the peace that humanity had been promised, and it tasted like ashes. Security Officer Victor Blake suggested they file a formal complaint with the Council, but Kyle knew it would be useless. He had tried that approach before on other worlds and received nothing but bureaucratic responses. The council moved slowly, they said. These matters required careful consideration. Meanwhile, humans suffered while aliens profited. Kyle promised Amy he would bring her story back to Earth, though he doubted anyone with real power would listen. On Earth, Commander Nathan Cross was discovering truths that made Kyle's observations seem minor by comparison. Nathan worked in military intelligence, analyzing alien communications that the Council assumed humans could not decrypt. Working late one night with analyst Lisa Bennett, he stumbled across something extraordinary. The Council had used the exact same treaty with 43 other species over the past 2,000 years. Every single one of those species had been promised probationary membership that would lead to full rights and equality. Not one had ever graduated from probationary status. Lisa pulled up economic data that painted a disturbing picture. Each species that joined the Council followed the same pattern. First came the golden age of trade and technology sharing. Then came the resource extraction and economic dependency. Within 20 years, every probationary species found themselves unable to function without Council support. Their militaries were too small to defend themselves. Their economies relied on Council-controlled trade routes. Their governments answered to Council advisors. They had been conquered without anyone firing a shot. Nathan took his findings to Admiral Gregory Stone, the highest-ranking officer in Earth's defense forces. The Admiral listened in grim silence as Nathan laid out the evidence. The treaty restrictions on military development were not about preventing war. They were about ensuring humanity could never resist. The limits on territorial expansion kept humans confined to worlds the Council deemed acceptable. The controls on weapons research guaranteed that humanity would always be technologically inferior. Every clause in the treaty served one purpose: keeping humanity weak. Admiral Stone called an emergency meeting with President Morgan, who was now serving her second term. Vice President Charles Newman and Defense Secretary Patricia Wells joined them in the secure situation room deep beneath the Capitol. The president looked older than her years as she reviewed the evidence. She had believed in the Council, had staked her legacy on peaceful integration with galactic civilization. Now she was learning that she had led humanity into a gilded cage. Dr. Helen Foster presented the final piece of the puzzle. Her research team, including physicist Ryan Carter and engineer Olivia Martinez, had been secretly studying Xanthari technology for years. What they discovered shocked everyone. The aliens were not more advanced than humanity. Their ships were faster because they had discovered faster-than-light travel 1,000 years earlier. But human engineers were already designing engines that would be superior. Their weapons were more powerful only because humans were forbidden from developing equivalent technology. In every meaningful way, humanity was the equal of any Council species, but the treaty kept them from realizing their potential. The implications were staggering. If humanity had been allowed to develop freely, they would now be building ships and weapons that could match or exceed anything the Council possessed. Instead, they had been deliberately held back, forced to rely on alien technology and alien permission for everything they did. The Council was not a peaceful democracy. It was an empire that used treaties and trade agreements instead of invasion fleets. The result was the same: conquered peoples who could not fight back. President Morgan faced the hardest decision of her political life. If they did nothing, humanity would spend the next 1,000 years as subjects of the Council, slowly losing their identity and independence until they became just another powerless species serving their alien masters. But if they tried to break free, the Council would respond with overwhelming force. Billions of humans could die in a war that humanity might not be able to win. General Marcus Webb, who had opposed the treaty from the beginning, laid out what resistance would require. Humanity needed a secret military buildup, shipyards hidden where Council sensors could not find them, weapons research conducted in complete secrecy. It would take years and consume enormous resources. If the Council discovered what they were doing before humanity was ready, Earth would be destroyed as an example to other species who might consider rebellion. Admiral Stone proposed calling the effort Project Defiance. The name seemed appropriate for what they were planning. Humanity would smile and bow to their Council masters while secretly forging the weapons of their liberation. Scientists would pretend to study alien technology, while actually developing superior human designs. Engineers would build freighters that could be quickly converted to warships. Colonies would establish hidden facilities in asteroid belts and on uninhabited moons. Every human in a position of authority would need to become an actor, playing the role of grateful junior partners while preparing for war. Defense Secretary Wells raised the obvious concern about traders. Some humans had become wealthy through council connections, trading with aliens and serving as intermediaries. These people had no interest in independence because the current system served them well. Others genuinely believed in the Council's mission and would see Project Defiance as a betrayal of humanity's commitment to peace. If any of them learned the truth and reported it to the Zenthari, everything would be lost. The president looked around the room at the faces of people she trusted. They were asking her to authorize treason against the very system she had championed. They were asking her to risk everything on the chance that humanity could fight and win against an empire that spanned the galaxy. But as she thought about the colonists on New Terra and the 43 other species that had been trapped in the same web, she realized there was no real choice. Freedom always came with risks, and slavery was not acceptable no matter how comfortable the chains. President Morgan gave the order. Project Defiance was authorized under the highest classification level. Only a handful of people would know the full scope of what was being planned. Funding would be hidden in legitimate budgets. Construction would happen in locations far from Council observers. Humanity would begin its secret march toward independence, knowing that discovery meant death but accepting that cost because the alternative was worse. They had tried peace and been betrayed. Now they would prepare for war, even though none of them wanted it. The galaxy had forced their hand, and humanity would not surrender without a fight. Project Defiance grew in the shadows like a secret that refused to stay buried. Colonel Andrew Sullivan commanded the operation from a hidden facility carved into an asteroid deep in the belt between Mars and Jupiter. His second-in-command, Major Christina Hayes, coordinated with shipyards scattered across human space, each one disguised as a mining operation or research station. They worked 18-hour days building warships that violated every council regulation, knowing that a single mistake could doom their entire species. The first battle carrier took shape in the darkness of space, assembled piece by workers who understood they were building humanity's future. They called it the Valiant, and it was beautiful in a deadly way. The ship stretched nearly a mile long, bristling with weapons that human engineers had designed in secret. Every system was built to exceed Council technology: faster engines, stronger shields, weapons that could punch through alien armor like paper. The workers welded and wired with pride, knowing their children might live free because of what they built today. On the frontier colonies, resistance grew among people who had suffered most under Council rule. Karen Phillips had been a colonial administrator before the Zenthari corporations arrived and destroyed everything she had worked to build. Now she ran an underground network that moved weapons, supplies, and information across human space without the Council ever knowing. Her network included smuggler Captain Derek Thompson, who could fly his ship through Council checkpoints with illegal cargo hidden in shielded compartments, and former diplomat Peter Jameson, who used his Council contacts to gather intelligence while pretending to be a loyal servant of the Empire. Karen's network operated on trust and desperation. Every person involved knew the penalty for rebellion was death, but they also knew that living as slaves was worse than dying free. They smuggled components for weapons factories hidden on remote moons. They transported scientists who had been marked for arrest by Council security. They carried messages between resistance cells, keeping the flame of defiance alive even in the darkest corners of human space. But the Council was not blind to everything. Inquisitor Zarvek arrived on Earth with a mandate to investigate rumors of human non-compliance. He was a Zenthari enforcer known for his ruthlessness, a being who had crushed rebellions on a dozen worlds. Commander Susan Morris, now serving as Earth's liaison to the Council, met him at the spaceport with a smile that hid her terror. She had become an expert at lying, her years of diplomatic training finally serving a purpose she had never imagined. Zarvek questioned her for hours about weapons production, military readiness, and reports of unauthorized research. Susan answered every question with carefully prepared lies, showing him fabricated records that proved humanity was following every Council regulation. She took him on tours of factories that produced nothing but civilian goods, introduced him to scientists who claimed to be studying alien technology rather than developing human innovations. The Inquisitor's multiple eyes watched her constantly, searching for any sign of deception, but Susan never broke character. However, the council had planted informants among humanity, people who profited from the current system and feared what independence might cost them. Vincent Gray was one such trader, a businessman who had grown wealthy trading human resources for alien luxuries. He had no loyalty to his own species, only to his bank accounts. When he learned about weapons research on the colony world of Freedom Station, he immediately contacted Zarvek with evidence that could not be denied. The Inquisitor moved with terrifying speed. Synthari warships surrounded Freedom Station within hours, cutting off all communications and supply lines. Governor Michelle Warren and hundreds of civilians were arrested and transported to council detention facilities. Zarvek demanded the locations of all human weapons facilities, threatening to starve the colony into submission if the governor refused to cooperate. Food shipments were blocked, medical supplies were confiscated, and the people of Freedom Station began to suffer. Governor Warren refused to break, even as her people faced starvation. She had been a teacher before becoming a political leader, a woman who believed in doing what was right regardless of the cost. Now she sat in a council prison cell, watching her people die slowly, knowing that speaking the truth would doom humanity's only chance at freedom. She endured interrogations, threats, and watching children cry from hunger. But she never revealed what she knew about Project Defiance. Captain Kyle Rogers, now secretly working with the Resistance, decided he could not stand by while innocent people suffered. He loaded his ship, the Horizon Runner, with medical supplies and food, then attempted to break through the Zenthari blockade. His navigator, Beth Anderson, plotted a course that should have gotten them through, but council sensors were more advanced than they had estimated. Zenthari fighters intercepted them before they reached Freedom Station, and the space battle that followed was brief and brutal. Beth died when an energy blast tore through the navigation console, and Kyle barely escaped with his life. His ship was crippled, leaking atmosphere, limping away from Freedom Station with Zenthari fighters in pursuit. He managed to reach a council trade route where the aliens would not risk firing on civilian traffic, but the cost had been terrible. Beth had been his friend for 5 years, and now she was gone because the council was willing to murder anyone who showed mercy to human prisoners. Kyle brought news of Freedom Station's situation back to Earth, and the message was clear. The council would rather commit genocide than lose control over humanity. Admiral Stone accelerated Project Defiance in response, pushing every facility to maximum production. The Valiant was completed ahead of schedule, and her captain, Commander Frank Morrison, handpicked a crew from volunteers who understood they might be flying to their deaths. 20 destroyers joined the battle carrier, along with 8 cruisers and hundreds of fighters. It was not enough to fight the entire council fleet, but it was enough to make humanity dangerous. President Morgan met with her advisors in the Situation Room, knowing that the moment of decision had arrived. Defense Secretary Patricia Wells argued that they had to act now, before the council discovered more of their preparations. Chief of Staff Larry Hudson counseled patience, suggesting they wait until humanity was stronger. But the decision was taken out of their hands when the Zenthari made their next move. Governor Warren and 50 of her officers were executed on live galactic broadcast. The council wanted every species to see what happened to those who resisted. Zarvek stood beside the execution ground, announcing that humanity's probationary period had revealed them unfit for galactic civilization. New restrictions were being implemented immediately. Human reproduction would be limited by quotas to prevent overpopulation. Genetic modification would be mandatory to make humans more compliant. Earth's government would be dissolved and replaced by direct council administration. Humanity was being told in clear terms that they were no longer even pretending to be partners. They were property, and the council would do with them as they pleased. General Marcus Webb appeared on every screen across human space within an hour of the executions. His uniform was crisp, his face was hard, and his words were simple. Humanity had tried peace and been betrayed. They had sought friendship and been enslaved. They had offered cooperation and received only exploitation. Now there was no choice left but to fight. He declared Earth's independence from the Galactic Council, knowing that the words themselves were a declaration of war. The secret was out, and humanity would either win their freedom or die trying. The age of submission was over, and the age of defiance had begun. The Galactic Council had never faced true resistance in 10,000 years. and they reacted with shock that quickly turned to rage. Supreme Chancellor Ix then convened an emergency session and declared humanity a threat to galactic peace. Fleet Marshal Dreknor, the highest-ranking military commander in the Zenthari forces, was given command of Battlefleet Primus, with orders to crush the human rebellion completely. 300 warships assembled at the Council's primary military base, enough firepower to reduce every human world to radioactive ash. Admiral Gregory Stone watched the Council fleet movements from Earth's command center and knew that humanity could not win a direct battle. The numbers were simply too overwhelming, but humans had never fought fair when survival was at stake, and Stone had no intention of starting now. He ordered Commander Frank Morrison to take the Valiant and 40 smaller ships on hit-and-run attacks against Council supply lines, while the rest of Earth's fleet hid in the Oort cloud, waiting for the right moment to strike. Morrison and his crew struck fast and disappeared faster. They would emerge from faster-than-light travel near a Council supply convoy, destroy as many ships as possible in the first 30 seconds, then jump away before reinforcements could arrive. The Zenthari called it cowardice, but Morrison called it survival. His crew consisted of volunteers who understood that every ship they destroyed was one less weapon pointed at Earth. They fought with a desperation that the Council species had forgotten, the desperation of people who had everything to lose. The first major battle happened at the Kepler Junction, a vital trade nexus where 6 different hyperspace routes intersected. General Andrew Sullivan, promoted from colonel after Project Defiance went public, led a strike force of 40 ships against a Council garrison that protected the junction. The Zenthari commander expected an easy victory, but he had never fought humans before. He learned too late that expecting victory and achieving it were very different things. Sullivan's ships came out of hyperspace in a formation the Council had never seen, spreading out in 3 dimensions rather than the traditional 2-dimensional plane that most species used. The Zenthari fired at empty space where they expected human ships to be, while Sullivan's forces hit them from above and below simultaneously. The battle lasted only 12 minutes, but in that time, 9 Council ships were destroyed and the junction was in human hands. Captain Derek Thompson died at Kepler Junction, in a way that would be remembered forever. His destroyer was crippled early in the fight, engines failing and weapons offline. Instead of retreating, he plotted a collision course with the largest Zenthari battlecruiser in the enemy formation. His crew had 30 seconds to reach the escape pods, and Derek stayed at the helm to make sure the course held true. The destroyer struck the battlecruiser at full speed, and both ships disappeared in an explosion that lit up the junction like a new sun. Derek sacrificed himself and his ship, but he took a vessel 10 times his size with him. News of the victory at Kepler Junction spread across the galaxy faster than the Council could suppress it. Other subjugated species began to whisper in their homes and secret meeting places. If humanity could resist the Council, perhaps others could too. The empire that had ruled for 10,000 years suddenly seemed less invincible. The carefully maintained illusion of Council supremacy was cracking, and light was seeping through the cracks. But the Council's response to defeat was predictable and brutal. Fleet Marshal Dreknor brought Battlefleet Primus to the human agricultural colony of Harvest, a world of farms and small towns defended only by civilian volunteers. Sheriff Matthew Cole led the defense with hunting rifles and improvised weapons, but there was no real hope of stopping warships designed for planetary bombardment. Dreknor gave no warning and accepted no surrender. He simply opened fire from orbit, and 5 million humans died in flames. The massacre at Harvest was meant to break human morale, but it achieved the opposite effect. Admiral Stone watched the broadcast of burning cities and made a decision that would define the rest of the war. He ordered every available human warship to assemble for a single massive strike at the heart of Council power. They would attack Nexus Prime itself, the capital world that had never been threatened in all of galactic history. Commander Morrison argued against the plan, calling it suicide. Major Christina Hayes agreed, pointing out that Nexus Prime was defended by 500 orbital platforms, 2 full battle fleets, and planetary shields that had withstood asteroid impacts without failing. But Stone understood something his officers did not. Wars were not won by mathematics alone. They were won by breaking the enemy's will to fight, and nothing would shatter Council confidence like seeing their capital under attack. Lieutenant Laura Bennett, now serving as the Valiant's tactical officer, planned the assault with the precision of a surgeon and the audacity of a gambler. The human fleet would use a captured Zenthari transponder to infiltrate Council space, pretending to be a friendly convoy until they were close enough to strike. Then they would throw everything they had at Nexus Prime's defenses, not to conquer the planet but to prove it could be done. 72 human ships emerged from faster-than-light travel directly above Nexus Prime at dawn. For 3 seconds, the Council defenders did not react, confused by the transponder codes that identified the fleet as friendly. Those 3 seconds were all Morrison needed. He gave the order to fire, and humanity announced their presence with violence that shook the orbital platforms. The battle that followed was chaos and death on a scale that humanity had never experienced. Council defense platforms fired with computer-guided precision while human ships dodged and weaved through the barrage. Missiles crossed the void in both directions, each one carrying enough explosive power to level a city. Energy beams cut through hulls like knives through cloth. Ships died on both sides, their crews vaporized or frozen or suffocated in the cold vacuum of space. The Valiant took hit after hit as Morrison drove his ship deeper into the defensive grid. Engineer Olivia Martinez worked miracles in the engine room, keeping the ship moving even as systems failed around her. Bulkheads collapsed, atmosphere vented, and crew members died at their stations, but the Valiant kept fighting. Morrison refused to retreat even when his tactical officer reported that their shields were gone and their hull was breached in 17 places. In a moment that would be taught in military academies for generations, Morrison gave an order that no sane captain would ever issue. He commanded ramming speed, pointing the Valiant directly at the largest orbital defense station in the grid. The crew knew what it meant, but nobody objected. They had volunteered for this mission knowing they might not return, and if they were going to die, they would die making a difference. The Valiant struck the defense station at a speed that turned both into expanding clouds of debris. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface, a new star that burned for several seconds before fading. But Morrison had achieved his goal. The defense station had been the primary coordinator for the entire orbital grid, and with it gone, there was a gap in Nexus Prime's shields. Human bombers led by squadron leader Tracy Evans dove through the gap before the Council could close it. They fired missiles at the planetary shield generators, hitting them with enough concentrated firepower to cause a cascade failure. For the first time in 10,000 years, Nexus Prime was vulnerable to attack from space. Admiral Stone, commanding from Earth, had his finger on the button that would order a full planetary bombardment. He could kill billions, could reduce the Council's capital to ruins, could take revenge for Harvest and Freedom Station and every other human who had died. But he did not give that order. Instead, he broadcast a message on every frequency, to every world in the galaxy. Humanity wanted peace, he said, but would accept nothing less than freedom. The Council could end this war right now by negotiating, or they could watch their capital burn. The choice was theirs to make. The Battle of Nexus Prime ended with a ceasefire, but peace was still far away. Supreme Chancellor Ix then agreed to negotiations under pressure from Council members who feared for their capital. But many species wanted to continue the war until humanity was completely destroyed. The Zenthari were especially bitter about their defeats, and Fleet Marshal Dreknor led a faction that refused to accept human independence. He gathered loyalists around him and began planning a final assault that would settle the matter once and for all. On Earth, President Elizabeth Morgan aged 10 years in the months following the battle. Her hair had gone completely gray, and the weight of billions of lives pressed down on her shoulders every moment. She met with Admiral Stone daily, knowing that the ceasefire was temporary and that the Council would strike again as soon as they rebuilt their forces. Stone had been promoted to Supreme Commander of all human military forces, and he spent every waking hour preparing for the next war that everyone knew was coming. But something unexpected began to happen across the galaxy. The Vryn, a mammalian species that resembled Earth's wolves, sent secret envoys to humanity. Ambassador Kethla arrived on Earth in a small ship, evading Council patrols to deliver a message that changed everything. Dozens of subjugated species had watched humanity's rebellion with growing hope. They too wanted freedom but lacked the strength to fight alone. If humanity could unite these species into an alliance, they might have enough power to defeat the Council permanently. Commander Nathan Cross, now serving as Director of Human Intelligence, saw the opportunity immediately. An alliance of the oppressed could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. President Morgan gave her approval, and Captain Kyle Rogers was chosen to lead the diplomatic mission. Kyle had lost friends in the war and carried scars both visible and hidden, but he understood better than most what was at stake. He took his damaged ship, the Horizon Runner, and began visiting worlds that the Council had conquered generations ago. Kyle's first stop was Vryn Prime, where he met with General Thomar, a military officer who was planning a coup against his own Council-loyal government. Thomar commanded 3 battle groups and had the loyalty of thousands of soldiers who were tired of serving an empire that treated them as second-class citizens. He promised that if humanity began the fight, the Vryn would join within hours. Kyle recorded the promise and moved on to his next destination. On the aquatic world of Thessera, Kyle met with scientist Ilna in an underwater city that humans needed special equipment to visit. Ilna had spent decades studying Council technology and discovered something remarkable. The Council had been suppressing technological development across the galaxy for thousands of years, keeping every species dependent on Zenthari innovations. Any scientist who discovered something too advanced disappeared, and their research was classified for security reasons. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked closely enough. The Council maintained power by keeping everyone else weak and ignorant. Kyle visited a dozen more worlds, meeting with rebels, scientists, merchants, and soldiers who all shared one thing in common. They were tired of living under Council rule, tired of watching their people exploited, tired of pretending that slavery was acceptable as long as it came with kind words. Each meeting added another potential ally to humanity's cause, and Kyle began to believe that real change might be possible. Back on Nexus Prime, Chancellor Ix then faced a crisis that threatened to tear the Council apart from within. The younger species, those who had been conquered most recently, demanded reforms and equal representation. The older species who had built the Empire refused to share power with beings they considered inferior. Council sessions became shouting matches, and the unity that had held the Empire together for 10,000 years began to fracture. Fleet Marshal Dreknor watched the Council's collapse with contempt. He had served the Empire his entire life, fighting wars and crushing rebellions to maintain Zenthari dominance. Now the Council was weak, paralyzed by debate while their enemies grew stronger. Dreknor decided that if the politicians would not act, the military would. He launched a coup, seizing control of the Zenthari fleet and declaring martial law across Council space. His message was simple. Earth would be destroyed, the rebellion would be crushed, and order would be restored. The second battle for Earth began without warning. Dreknor brought 600 warships, the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. Admiral Stone had barely 200 ships to defend humanity's homeworld, and even with every defensive platform and orbital weapon active, the odds were impossible. Stone prepared evacuation plans for Earth's major cities, knowing that billions might die in the coming hours. But Kyle Rogers returned with reinforcements that nobody expected. 20 Vryn cruisers dropped out of hyperspace alongside Earth's defense fleet. 15 Thesseran carriers followed, their aquatic crews operating ships designed to function underwater as easily as in space. Ships from a dozen other species joined the battle, each one carrying warriors who had decided that freedom was worth fighting for. General Thomar kept his promise, bringing his forces to stand with humanity against the empire that had enslaved them all. The battle raged in Earth's orbit for 3 days without pause. Ships died by the dozens, crews fought until their ammunition was exhausted and the void filled with debris and bodies. Commander Frank Morrison had survived the Battle of Nexus Prime against all odds, and now he commanded the new flagship, the Earth defense ship Liberty. His crew included humans and aliens working together, a preview of what the galaxy could become if they won. On the third day, when both sides were exhausted and victory seemed impossible for either fleet, Dreknor made his final move. He saw that he could not win a conventional battle, so he decided to ram Earth directly with his flagship. The massive dreadnought accelerated toward the planet, and nothing in the human fleet was close enough to intercept in time. 10 billion people looked up at the sky and saw death approaching. Colonel Christina Hayes commanded the destroyer Defiant from a position on the fleet's edge. She saw what Dreknor intended and knew what had to be done. Without asking for orders, she pushed her engines to maximum and threw her ship into the dreadnought's path, The two vessels collided in an explosion that lit up the entire orbital space. Christina and her crew of 300 died instantly, but Earth survived. The battle turned after that. With Dreknor dead, the Zinthari fleet lost its cohesion. Some ships retreated, others surrendered, and the second battle for Earth ended in victory for the Allied forces. On Nexus Prime, the Council collapsed completely. Chancellor Ix then resigned in disgrace, and the old order crumbled as subjugated species declared independence one after another. Within months, the Galactic Council ceased to exist as a governing body. President Morgan proposed something to replace it: a free systems alliance where every species would be equal, where each world governed itself, and where cooperation was voluntary rather than mandatory. The first session of the Alliance Congress met on neutral ground with representatives from 50 liberated worlds. President Morgan stood at the podium beside Ambassador Kethla and General Thomar, speaking to an audience that included beings of every imaginable form. She told them that humanity had tried peace and been betrayed, that they had fought not for conquest but for freedom, and that now they offered what had been denied to them. The age of empires was over, and the age of free peoples had begun. Admiral Stone retired from military service and spent his final years writing about the cost of freedom. Captain Kyle Rogers became an ambassador, traveling between worlds to help build the new order. They all remembered the billions who had died, the friends and comrades lost in battles that should never have been necessary, but they also knew that the sacrifice had meaning. The galaxy would never be the same because humanity refused to accept slavery, and in refusing, they had shown every other species that freedom was possible. The old empire was gone and something better had taken its place.